Good evening, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Hassan, calling in from occupied Lenape territory, and I'm a member of the Red Nation, an indigenous-led organization guided by the principles of revolutionary socialism, indigenous feminism, and decolonization. The Red Nation came together with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, as well as the Center for Political Education, to put together the Friday Night Forums. These forums are a series of conversations on critical topics which offer us lessons for international solidarity. The COVID-19 crisis is a global crisis and thus requires a global response. By providing anti-imperialist perspectives from around the world, we hope to offer left movements in the so-called United States ways to be joint in struggle with those facing the brunt of violence from the US empire, while keeping in mind anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles on Turtle Island. Be sure to join us also next week when we discuss abolition and building solidarity with prisoners of the empire. Today we'll be discussing a topic which is facing unprecedented propaganda warfare from ultra-right warhawks to liberals and progressives across the US political spectrum, China. We hope to provide fact-based and historically contextualized narratives which can counter the yellow peril and xenophobic-infused mainstream narratives on China, Chinese people, and Chinese Americans. Not only are we seeing waves of anti-Asian hate crimes within the West, but we're also seeing heightening military aggression in areas surrounding China. Dubbed the pivot to Asia, the US imperialists are hoping to shift their violent focus from the Middle East towards East Asia for a new era of warfare and economic domination, which would only result in suffering and death. We understand that all victims of imperialism are united under a common struggle. Tonight, I'm extremely honored to have some of the most insightful and dedicated voices on China speaking on our panel. I will introduce each speaker before they begin, and afterwards we will have a question and answer session with the audience. Please pose your questions in the Q&A function if you're on Zoom, and if you're watching a live stream on Facebook or YouTube, you can post your questions in the chat, and one of our comrades will forward the questions to us. So to begin, I introduce Kevin Lee. Kevin is a member of the Chiao Collective, joining from Olon Territory, also known as San Francisco. Kevin's interests include Chinese Marxism, science fiction, and history. The Chiao Collective is a collective of diaspora Chinese writers, artists, and students in the US working to challenge US aggression against China. Recently, the Chiao Collective published a great interview with Vijay Prashad, someone who joined us a few sessions ago and really invigorated our audience, as I remember. Vijay addressed misconceptions on China and Chinese commerce, and I encourage everyone to check that out. So to begin, I'll let Kevin take it away.
Thank you for the fantastic introduction, Hassan. So, as Hassan said, I'm Kevin. I'm a member of Chiao Collective, and I'm joining from Ohlone Land, also known as the Bay Area. So I am very honored to have the opportunity to speak today. Again, we're a collective of Chinese diaspora writers, artists, and students working to challenge rising US aggression against China. And we formed our collective after becoming increasingly concerned with serious gaps and misrepresentations in the Western left's discourse on China. Sorry, are you showing my slides? So, sorry, can people see my slides?
Give us a moment, we're putting it up right now.
Okay.
There we go.
Alrighty, all right, perfect, thanks. So we hope to create a space and a culture where those living in the United States and Western aligned nations can listen and learn with humility and openness when it comes to topics that are highly propagandized in Western media. So ultimately, we hope that our work equips more anti-war, anti-imperialist, and socialist thinkers and activists to understand the role of China and all of our shared stakes in the fight against Western imperialism and global capitalism. Can I get a next slide, please? So first, I want to talk about the role of Chinese socialism in China's COVID-19 response. So I want to explain how China's socialist political economic system allowed the party state to quickly mobilize its productive capacities to provide medical supplies, hospital capacity, and people power for China's pandemic response. Corporate media has called the incredible measures the Chinese state, the Communist Party, and the Chinese people jointly undertook to stop the spread of COVID-19 as authoritarian. But the backbone of China's pandemic response is not authoritarianism, it's actually socialism. So what is China's economic governance system that enabled it to defeat COVID-19? Zhang Weiwei, a professor of international relations at Fudan University, pictured here in this slide, describes China's unique economic and governance system as the China model. China's economy is a socialist market economy, which was innovated by the Communist Party and is essentially a mixed economy of strong state planning with market forces. The Chinese state controls entire industries, including banking, agriculture, healthcare, oil, electricity, and construction. This means that all the companies in those industries are run by the government and all the employees are government employees. They are the largest state-owned industries in the world. Now, when it comes to private industry, the state maintains strict control over the technically private industry in order to ensure that the private market ultimately serves the interests of the Communist Party, which in turn serves the people. Zhang Weiwei has an excellent series of papers and a 1-hour lecture on YouTube, if anyone's interested in learning more. Next slide. So in a moving press conference on January 29th, Zhang Wenhong, chief doctor of the Shanghai Medical Treatment Expert Team, announced that he replaced the frontline civilian doctors with party doctors. Praising the efforts of first responders, he said in a viral clip, for which the screenshots are shown on the slide, that party members had taken an oath to serve the people that must be fulfilled, exemplifying that the Communist Party of China serves people above everything. Next slide, please. So party members across all industries were deployed to the front line to take temperatures, maintain migration, treat patients, administer tests, deliver groceries, among other tasks. So if you look at the screenshots of this viral clip here of Wuhan doctors removing their masks, notice that all of them are wearing a CPC lapel. This is a moving testament to party doctors' sacrifice and dedication to keep the Chinese people safe during the height of the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about the role of volunteer neighborhood communities. So since the outbreak, nearly 4 million community workers in neighborhood committees, which originate from China's communist commune system, have been fighting COVID-19 in 650,000 communities. These community workers, most of whom are the party members, provide on-the-ground day-to-day application of China's pandemic response by conducting door-to-door health visits, distributing groceries and supplies to the elderly and those in quarantine, monitoring temperature checks at markets and other public spaces, among other things. This exemplifies the strong socialist culture in China. And I want to talk a little bit from personal experience as well. So my family in China is actually from Hubei province, the little epicenter of the pandemic in China. And I have several family members who were in these neighborhood committees, like throughout kind of the worst of the pandemic. Like they were fundraising, they were going out delivering groceries. They, it was actually like, the tone was almost like it was a lot of camaraderie there too. So, and they're not doctors, they're, bureaucrats, they're business people, but in this time of need, they also come together and serve their neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So the combination of state workers and community volunteers speaks to the socialist mobilization of both popular and state channels to meet the needs of people during the pandemic. China recognized that you can't tell the people to quarantine at home without making sure their basic needs are met. These popular and party efforts make sure that people could safely quarantine at home while receiving the medical and practical support they needed. Next slide, please. So a pillar of China's pandemic response is the party state's power over the economy and means of production. China's economic system is poorly understood, particularly in the West, but China's complex market socialist economy retains strong state control over both state-owned enterprises as well as private firms, which are mandated to retain an internal committee staffed by party members. This level of economic oversight allowed the CPC to quickly pivot production towards pandemic necessities such as N95 masks, PPE, and hospitals. Next slide. So in China's Ministry of Industry has described how its centralized response has addressed medical supply shortages. A committee of party members coordinated with regional production sites to produce 28 million protective gowns, 2.5 million N95 masks, 800,000 eye masks between just January 28th and February 25th. Similarly, the Ministry of Commerce oversaw the production and distribution of food supplies in Hubei, ensuring a steady supply of basics such as grain, pork, oil, and eggs, and distributing to neighborhoods in Hubei. So this is what my aunt was doing. She was going door to door delivering fresh groceries. Next slide. So for instance, state-owned oil company Sinopec pivoted from producing oil to producing medical masks by investing $42 million in converting 2 factories to ramping up medical mask production. These decisions are made possible by the structure of state-owned enterprises, which answer to the party which serves the needs of the Chinese people, not private corporate profit interests. Next slide. And the example of hospitals that were built in 10 days in Wuhan are examples of how the state pivots production forces in China to serve the people. The hospitals themselves got a lot of press, but few people understand how they were built and what that exemplifies about China's system. The reason they were able to be built so fast is because the state owns and controls China's banking, construction, and telecom industries, amongst many other industries that are critical for public good. In addition, land is all nationalized, so the state has the power to seize any land they need to serve people's needs. State-owned China State Construction Engineering undertook the rapid construction of 2 emergency quarantine hospitals in Wuhan. State-owned electrical company China State Grid contributed over $16 million and built the hospital's electricity facilities. They also ensured that every single household in all of China during the quarantine could receive electricity regardless of their ability to pay. This type of mass pivoting of production forces to serve people's needs is unheard of and impossible in countries like the US, where these same industries are fully privatized. There is no profit motive or interest in building hospitals that provide free healthcare and don't charge their patients, as in this case with hospitals in Wuhan. The free market would have never allocated resources in this way, as we would have seen in the US pandemic response, where private industry has utterly failed to provide basic necessities such as PPE for frontline workers. Next slide, please. Now, on the left is a news article documenting how the government sent government workers throughout all of China's markets and stores to punish price gougers on food and medical supplies. On the right is an example of how the central government emphasized that the fundamental guiding principle that every single government actor, from Xi Jinping down to local provincial governments, emphasized that life comes before everything. They place life above profit, above the economy, and especially above the profit interests of corporations. Next slide. And no country has rivaled China's pandemic response in terms of sheer scale and rigor of its response. For instance, in May, after a handful of new cases were reported in Wuhan, the city government began a new round of mass testing to provide free nucleic acid COVID tests for the city's 11 million residents. Within just a week of the campaign launched on May 14th, over half of the city's residents have been tested. To put this in perspective, as of today, the CDC reports that the US has tested 13 million people total since the beginning of the pandemic outbreak in February, a low testing rate that experts say is a major roadblock to safely reopening. So overall, China's strong state intervention in the economy, mass public participation, and the mobilization of party members and civil servants represents a compelling alternative system that speaks to the strengths of Chinese socialism. Next slide. Now, I want to address the second main theme of this talk, which is how China's international aid and cooperation during the COVID pandemic demonstrates China's vision of multilateralism and international solidarity. China's dedication to these principles of cooperation, solidarity, and aid provide a powerful alternative model to that of the US empire, which has perpetuated debilitating sanctions, bombings, and militarization during the pandemic. So first, what are China's fundamental principles when it comes to international relations, and what is this approach? During the late 2000s, the Communist Party of China, during Hu Jintao's presidency, coined the phrase community of a shared future for mankind, or in Mandarin, it's 人类命运共同体, to define their approach to foreign policy and efforts to usher in multilateralism and peace, as opposed to war and aggression. China has a long history of being subjugated, colonized, and pillaged during the century of humiliation. Western powers wanted to carve up China, which it did succeed partially back then and still wants to do today. This has left a trauma and scar on the psyche of China and the Chinese people today. As such, their foreign policy reflects this. They unequivocally do not want turmoil, war, or conflict. They want peace and are invested in a win-win approach to democracy that emphasizes true respect of other nations' sovereignty. Next slide, please. In line with this principle of multilateralism, internationalism, and international cooperation, President Xi wrote a letter to the world on the need of global solidarity to defeat the pandemic, writing, Only by cooperating can the world overcome this pandemic. The world is a community with a shared future. We must help one another, join hands, and build a better global home. Now, next slide, please. So amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, China has demonstrated for the world internationalism. The cornerstone of China's foreign policy is unequivocally pushing for multilateralism and solidarity. China has made several huge announcements a few days ago stating that, one, China will universally share its vaccine with the world as a global public good. Two, China will donate $2 billion to the WHO, a third of their $6 billion budget, earmarked specifically to aid developing countries left stranded by the US's $500 million withdrawal. And three, China will aid in strengthening Africa's CDC by sending doctors and medical aid. Now, next slide. In particular, China's pandemic aid to nations struggling under unilateral US sanctions exemplifies China's vision for a more humane world. For instance, during the pandemic, China has sent Venezuela 300,000 test kits, doctors, and millions in medical supplies, while Cuba has sent doctors, all in defiance of US sanctions on Venezuela. Next slide, please. Chinese aid came just days after the IMF rejected a Venezuelan appeal for an emergency $5 billion loan to fight the pandemic, and the World Health Organization has struggled to bypass US sanctions on Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba to coordinate an effective response. These are sanctions that Chinese officials said they refused to honor during this humanitarian crisis. Upon receiving China's fifth plane of medical aid sent to Venezuela in defiance of the US blockade, President Maduro declared, "Venezuela is not alone in our fight. I thank President Xi Jinping and the Chinese people for the solidarity." Next slide. Iran has similarly struggled to address the pandemic because of US sanctions. China has both demanded the US lift its sanctions on Iran and sent significant aid to Iran in direct defiance of US sanctions. On March 17th, China sent 15 tons of Chinese relief supplies, including test kits, ventilators, disinfectant, and protective masks, which was one of multiple shipments. Next slide. China has sent 18 medical consignments to Iran to help Iran fight the coronavirus outbreak, in addition to doctor delegations sent by China and a crowd-funded fundraiser posted by the Iranian embassy in China on Weibo, which raised over $500,000 US, donated by Chinese people for Iran's pandemic response. That the US has continued its sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, while China has refused to honor those sanctions despite the risk of secondary sanctions, speaks to the two nations' very different approaches to international relations. Next slide. An illustrative example of the US versus China's approach to international engagement is the fact that on March 9th, right at the height of COVID-19 pandemic in Iraq, a US missile bombed Iraq, killing multiple people. The same week on March 13th, China sent what would be the first of many rounds of planes of full medical teams and doctors and millions in medical aid. So China's team of doctors stayed for 50 days in Iraq, where they installed a CT scanner in Baghdad, traveled across Iraq to train doctors and nurses, distribute medical supplies, and built 2 COVID-19 testing labs that tripled Iraq's testing capacity. Throughout those same 50 days, the US continued to bomb, threaten, and deploy troops in Iraq. On a related note, in 2019, Iraq joined China's Belt and Road Initiative and forged a 20-year deal with China to trade oil for China to rebuild Iraq after years of war by the US. Iraq's then prime minister declared, "Iraq has gone through war and strife and is therefore grateful to China for its valuable support in rebuilding our land." China's state companies and construction workers will spend the next 20 years building highways, sewage systems, schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, railways, ports, and airports that were all destroyed by US war in Iraq. Next slide. So in sum, China has sent hundreds of doctors, billions in medical supplies, and skill-shared clinical information with over 116 countries in the world. China's socialist state production and global cooperation is equipping the world with tools to fight coronavirus, offering a vision of a world without US hegemony. US economic hegemony means that most of the world complies with unilateral US sanctions for fear of secondary sanctions or being blocked from US-controlled financial institutions and markets. These are the life and death stakes in the fight against US financial imperialism. And China has taken a leading role in violating US sanctions to provide critical aid and trade to global South nations. To challenge this world over, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and China practice deep internationalism to survive a global system of US empire. We need to understand this bloc on its own terms. It's not a coincidence that the most propagandized nations on earth are also the ones fighting US imperialism and are building socialism. We encourage people to learn from these nations that their fight to usher in a more humane world. Next slide. So I think it's behind. So maybe another on this side, and then another one. Okay. So actually, can you go ahead one more time? All right. So finally, I want to address how the US is weaponizing the COVID pandemic to advance an aggressive Cold War strategy against China. Clearly, amidst rhetoric of the Chinese virus and conspiracy theories that COVID-19 was created in a Wuhan biotechnology lab, the United States ruling class is ramping up aggression and propaganda intended to demonize China and displace blame for white supremacist capitalism's exacerbation of the pandemic onto China. Now, the West has pushed false narratives that China covered up the pandemic or that Li Wenliang was a whistleblower, despite these false narratives being thoroughly debunked by numerous journalists and organizations, including Vijay Prasad, Fair Media Watch Group, public health authorities, former US CDC administrators, and the World Health Organization. However, it's important to note that this increasing aggression on China began long before the COVID-19 crisis. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia has marked US strategy towards China for the last decade. It misrepresents China as a geopolitical threat in order to justify an anti-China containment strategy. Next slide. In 2019, the US Army announced 2 regional task forces that would combat the strategic threat of China through a focus on non-conventional warfare to maintain US military dominance in the regime. The Department of Defense has previously designated the Pacific as its priority theater and conducts routine military drills in Japan and South Korea, while selling $2 billion in arms to Taiwan in 2019 alone. This escalation of US military power in Asia, under the rationale of containing China, makes clear that opposing US antagonism towards China is paramount for future hopes of peace and demilitarization in Asia and the Pacific. Amidst this longer history of escalation, the United States is using the pretext of COVID-19 to ramp up its military economic strategy in Asia, with disastrous consequences for communities across the Asia Pacific. Next slide. The US military recently released its Indo-Pacific Command budget plan titled Regain the Advantage. It's a chilling glimpse into US escalation of its military presence in Asia under the premises of containing China. The plan requested $20 billion to retain what the military euphemistically refers to as an asymmetric military advantage in Asia. It exacerbates the colonial and neo-colonial conditions of nations across Asia and the Pacific. For instance, the report calls for a massive expansion of missile, radar, and precision strike networks across the Pacific Islands and Oceania, including Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii. Next slide. These strategic documents make clear that movements for decolonization and anti-imperialism in Asia and the Pacific depend on an unequivocal condemnation of US escalation towards war on China. Despite sensationalist reports from the Pentagon and State Department, unlike the United States, China does not maintain a vast array of military bases abroad. We can't let this myth of the threat of China be used to naturalize the reality of ongoing US military occupation, imperialism, and militarization across the world. Next slide. So we're entering into a moment in which the phrase of a new Cold War is being popularly used to describe tense US-China relations. While the term is apt for describing the spirit of McCarthyism, which seeks to stifle all critique of US policy towards China, let alone support for the Communist Party of China and solidarity with the Chinese people, we need to resist framing that this is a mutual escalation. This is a fallacy, which frames global geopolitics as a zero-sum hegemonic contest. Chinese state officials, intellectuals, and philosophers all have stated emphatically that China does not seek to replace the US as a global hegemon. The US and China are not equal evils. This is a fallacy designed to fearmonger and justify US aggression and imperialism. China's vision of multilateralism and internationalism for the world runs counter to the US understanding of the world. Next slide. Again, this is not a competition between competing imperialisms or competing nationalisms. This is a contest between an imperialist power, which has enforced anti-human sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea during a global pandemic, and a rising global South nation that has dedicated itself to providing aid indiscriminate of ideology or alliance. False equivalencies between the US and China only obscure the roots of this coming conflict, the desire for the maintenance of a US hegemony by any means necessary. Okay, so to end my talk, what we as a collective want people to take away from our work is that the US has a vested interest in ensuring that its people do not want to see that there are other models of governance, economic, and international relations that are being practiced successfully by other countries. There are highly successful systems out there that are alternatives to the US's own capitalist imperialist systems that embody socialist principles of self-determination, public good over profit, and international cooperation. We hope we can all join forces and build this kind of shared world. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kevin. We know that was a lot of information to pack into 20 minutes. Next, we have Amanda Yee. Amanda graduated with a master's in medical anthropology from SOAS in London, where she studied the cultural perceptions and politics around health and illness. She's now an independent analyst in New York City, and she has appeared in Al Jazeera, CGTN, and The New Inquiry. Go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks, Hassan. So I'm Amanda. First, I'd like to thank the Red Nation and the Center for Political Education and the Arab Resource and Organizing Center for organizing this. And thank you for inviting me to be on this amazing panel. I'm here to discuss, I'm going to talk about the US representation of China, the ways in which mainstream media represents it, and how through that we come to know China, or what we understand is China. So as an entry point, I first want to talk about some of the more horrific consequences of this type of representation, which is that the number of hate crimes against Asian people in the US and around the world is skyrocketing. In New York City, where I live, the New York City Commission on Human Rights has received 117 harassment and discrimination complaints involving COVID-19 related anti-Asian sentiments this year alone. For comparison, around the same time last year, they only received 5. And I've been following a lot of these racist incidents, these hate crimes, and what's really common is that the attacker often blames the Asian victim as the carrier of COVID-19, or blames them for bringing the virus into the States. So the mainstream response to this escalating number of hate crimes has been to blame these on Trump, and Trump calling it the China virus. I think that response is insufficient in 2 ways. First of all, it's ahistorical, and second of all, it sort of ignores the geopolitical dynamics at play. It's ahistorical in the sense that working class Chinese came to the US in the mid-19th century, first as part of the California Gold Rush, then later to build the railroads. And they have a long history of being scapegoated for different public health crises, being scapegoated as racialized carriers of infectious illnesses. So these stereotypes of Chinese people being carriers of disease, they're as old as Chinese immigration to the States itself. Back then, Chinese laborers came to the States through borrowing money from a broker, and all the money they earned would go toward paying that back plus interest. So these laborers were overwhelmingly men, and since all of their money earned went toward paying back the broker plus interest, they couldn't save enough money to bring their wives and families back to the States. So this sex work industry involving East Asian women developed as a response to that. This industry created a moral panic among white Americans, and the American Medical Association actually believed Chinese sex workers would pass what they called Chinese diseases onto their white clientele. So as a response, the US passed the Page Act in 1875, which was also referred to as the Oriental Exclusion Act. And this barred entry to what they considered undesirable immigrants into the states, but it primarily targeted East Asian women. And this was really the first restrictive immigration law in the United States. And around the same time, San Francisco's Chinatown at that time was extremely densely populated due to the high demand for Chinese workers building the railroads. And these workers were living in these tightly packed conditions, which made them much more susceptible to infectious illnesses. Rather than attribute this to poverty and neglect on the part of the city, a lot of people just saw Chinese immigrants, they assumed them to be more likely to carry smallpox, cholera, and the bubonic plague. And it was actually the smallpox epidemic and other sorts of public health concerns that would be used as the basis for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers for decades until its repeal in 1943. So that's the history of why Chinatown and Chinese people still raise this specter of uncleanliness and disease in Westerners' minds, which is made most obvious during a disease outbreak like COVID or SARS. So Trump calling this the China virus is actually part of this historical continuity. It doesn't come out of nowhere, and it's why it has so much purchase, right? Because it has to have that kind of referent to allude to. So blaming these hate crimes on Trump calling it the China virus, it's ahistorical, and it also ignores the geopolitical dynamics that are at play, which in this political moment sort of incentivizes blaming China. So the US always has to have sort of an external enemy to position itself up against. And it always has like this chauvinist impulse to rally the nation against an external threat, right? China right now is the second largest global economy, and it's set to eclipse the US pretty soon. The US is the dominant global hegemon right now, but it's not a position that it wants to give up willingly. And the primary US national security concern is no longer terrorism, but this sort of interstate economic, political, and military competition. And US foreign policy's primary objective is to blunt the ascendance of a new competitor. The Trump administration has repeatedly stated publicly and in policy documents that the economic and political ascendance of China is the primary US concern to national security right now. In January, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called the Chinese Communist Party the central threat to our times, claiming that the Chinese government threatened our own American way of life and of our own Western democratic principles. In April, Mitt Romney wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post in which he said that China has a grand strategy for economic, military, and geopolitical domination, and that they're conducting an alarming military buildup. This ignoring the fact that the US spends 3 times as much as China on military expenditures. So given all this, there is a political incentive to blame China as part of an effort to blunt its economic and political influence. In March, the Daily Beast obtained a State Department cable in which the White House instructed officials when speaking to journalists to shift the blame of the COVID-19 pandemic onto China and to focus on China orchestrating a cover-up which allowed the pandemic to spread the way that it did. And so this is, you can sort of see how the levers of power work here. Around this time was when Trump started calling the virus the China virus, and shortly thereafter, mainstream media published a series of op-eds written by think tank people defending the use of the term. Like Mark Thiessen, who's a former George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld speechwriter, and currently works at the American Enterprise Institute. He published an op-ed in the Washington Post defending Trump's use of the term China virus, and Shadi Hamid, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, wrote a similar piece in The Atlantic around the same time. I also want to mention that a few weeks ago, the National Republican Senatorial Committee released a 57-page memo instructing GOP candidates to address the COVID-19 crisis by aggressively attacking and blaming China, stressing 3 talking points. One is that China covered it up in the beginning stages. The second is that Democrats are soft on China. And the third is that Republicans will push for sanctions on China that will punish China for its role in this pandemic. And this is why you see states like Missouri announcing that they plan to sue China for reparations. So these 2 things, the State Department cable and the GOP memo, they sort of pull back the curtain on this relationship between US government and mainstream media. Mainstream media functions as this sort of ideological apparatus of US empire, in that its role is to fall in line with and drum up support for US foreign policy. And, Iraq is the most obvious example in our lifetimes, but we saw it recently with Bolivia and Venezuela as well, right? And it does so through the right of representation, that is, its power and ability to define our understandings of a given region, of a given people. In the case of China, media follows the Orientalist tradition of not defining China as it actually is, but defining it in its supposed relation to the West, so that China never fully exists on its own terms, but is instead held up as a foil to Western civilizational superiority. And China is not unique in this regard. This is also very similar to the way that we understand the Middle East and the way that we understand Iran, right? So this type of Orientalist and xenophobic representation operates on 2 levels, the political and the cultural. As a government, China is imagined as an authoritarian regime, a human rights disaster, always lying, always deceitful, a moral crisis to be solved. And the implication there is that it's to be solved by the US through the implementation of Western liberal democracy. On the cultural level, as a people, China is imagined as morally and culturally inferior, a backward civilization, barbaric, filthy, diseased, weird eating habits, so cruel that they'll eat anything that moves. And so this assumption is that unless stopped, China will impose its own backward political and cultural civilization onto the West. And that's why Mike Pompeo called China the central threat to our times, as I mentioned earlier. That's why Mitt Romney wrote that sensationalist op-ed in the Washington Post, decrying China's strategy for geopolitical domination. And that's why Chinese people in the US have historically been imagined as racialized carriers of disease polluting the white American population. These assumptions, political and cultural, also explain the 2 primary ways that US mainstream media has covered China and COVID-19 since the virus's emergence in Wuhan. On the cultural level, in the beginning stages of the epidemic, there was this obsessive coverage of Chinese dietary habits, the weird exotic things that they eat, traditional Chinese medicine, and the weird exotic animal parts that are used in that, and these so-called wet markets, the supposed unhygienic conditions of these wet markets, the kinds of animals that were sold at these wet markets. And what these did was revive old stereotypes of Chinese people as filthy and backward and carriers of disease. So I just want to take a moment here to point out that the Orientalist wet market hysteria is usually driven by people who don't know the difference between a wet market and the wildlife trade, which are 2 different things, right? Wet market is any market that sells fresh food and fresh produce, and is fairly common. And we actually have them in the States. but we just don't call them wet markets, we call them farmers markets, right? And the wildlife trade is something separate and not as common. So this term wet market only entered popular discourse after the emergence of COVID-19. The term is a dog whistle in the same way that bushmeat was during the Ebola outbreak, in that wet market is an exoticized term for what we would call a fresh market or farmer's market. And bushmeat is sort of an exoticized term for any non-domesticated animal hunted for food. And what these terms do is that they both revive old stereotypes of certain non-white people as dirty and barbaric, and just barbaric enough to eat these animals Westerners would never touch, placing the blame of disease on their own savagery. So simultaneously on the political level, we had corporate media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post using the COVID-19 crisis as a way of undermining the Chinese government's legitimacy. The New York Times ran headlines like coronavirus exposes core flaws and few strengths in China's governance. Coronavirus crisis shows China's governance failure. And another one is in coronavirus, a battle that could humble China's strongman. Foreign Policy published an article entitled How China's Incompetence Endangered the Entire World. And The Atlantic published an article with the headline, Democracies are better at fighting outbreaks. China's harsh response to the coronavirus has influential admirers, but Western nations recognize that public health fundamentally depends on public trust. And you see here through these stories and headlines how China is always presented in opposition to the West, a totalitarian regime as a foil to Western liberal democracy. But soon China gained control of its epidemic, and the epicenter of the outbreak shifted to the US. But there was still this obsessive hyper focus on China, and there was still a certain consistency in its media coverage that you could rely on. China and the Chinese government is imagined as always lying, as always deceitful. Whatever good it does is always driven by some ulterior motive. So when China started sending PPE and medical staff to other countries, it was accused by the New York Times of currying favor as part of a humanitarian PR campaign to gain geopolitical currency from other countries in direct competition with the US. When China was further along in developing a vaccine than the US responded by accusing China of hacking and stealing our research. When President Xi Jinping vowed to make the vaccine publicly available, the media framed it as part of an effort to defuse criticism of his government's response to a pandemic that has killed 315,000 around the world. And that's a quote from Bloomberg News. When China pledged to donate $200 billion to the World Health Organization to combat the virus, which is 2 times more than what the US has given before Trump cut off funding. So it pledged to donate $200 billion to the World Health Organization, and it pledged to dispatch medical staff to Africa. The New York Times framed it as an attempt to deflect scrutiny that they hid information about the virus in the beginning stages. Last month, China revised its COVID-19 death count for the same reasons every country has been doing so. Which is because in the beginnings of the epidemic, it's really messy and you can't really get an accurate death toll. And so all these countries started to revise their numbers to account for early deaths in the beginning, like in homes and hospitals and hospices. So the UK and New York City revised their death counts around the same time for exactly the same reasons, and nobody batted an eye. But when China did it, it quote unquote renewed skepticism of its official numbers. when China banned funeral gatherings to prevent the spread of the virus, which every other country has done, both the New York Times and the Washington Post accused the CCP of doing so to deny emotional families the chance to get together and complain about the government's handling of the outbreak, which would have revived criticisms of its mishandling of information in the beginning. So I'll end this by saying this. Analyzing this way that corporate media represents China and dehumanizes Chinese people is important because it shapes our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Given that the US now has over 1.6 million confirmed cases, the most out of any country in the world, Russia is a distant second at, I think, a little over 300,000. We should be cooperating with and learning from China, but instead we're engaging in this revived yellow peril rhetoric, which precludes any sort of opportunity for international cooperation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Next, we have Alex T. Tom. Alex is a former executive director of the Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco and the co-founder of China Education Exposure Program. Currently, he's the executive director of the Center for Empowered Politics, a new movement-building project which aims to train and develop new leaders of color and grow grassroots power, building infrastructure. Last year, Alex received the OSF Racial Justice Fellowship to develop a toolkit to counter the rise of new Chinese right wing in the US. He has an awesome and autistic 5-year-old son and blogs about parenting and politics. Take it away, Alex.
Hey everyone, this is Alex. I go by he, him pronouns. And yeah, I'm just very honored to be on this panel webinar. This is my first time being on live. And yes, it's gonna be great to have this kind of conversation because I think it's very rare to have a space for leftists to really understand and dig into the contradictions that we're seeing right now. So I wanted to introduce myself first, and I come into this conversation with a somewhat complicated identity. Many of us have complex identities, but I just wanted to name them. My father is, his family came from southern China, Canton area. My mother is from their family was from Jiangxi, which is kind of like middle region, and then eventually went to Taiwan before 49, the revolution or liberation of China. And then I had family on both sides that left China and also that stayed in China, that became party members. And I think this is the what I wanted to lift up is like the way we want to enter this conversation is to be dialectic about what's happening like in the US, but also in China. Through a lot of my paid and non-paid work, I've done a lot of work to understand the role of China and internationalism. And one of the things that we did was because we didn't feel like there was a very good understanding of what was happening in China, we started a program called the China Education Exposure Program. And this was about 10 years ago. And it was really important because at that time, China was just about to open up around basically in, I think after Tiananmen Square and a bunch of the things with like the Olympics, like we started to be able to have access to coming into China to understand what's happening on the ground. So we built relationships with people in the party, activists underground, and also NGOs. And it was fluid. Like from year to year, things would change, right? And so I just think that some of these things need to be understood in an arc of time, right? The last thing I'd say is that I'm not an expert on China, but I want to just lift up the stories of people in China. And that's the best I can do in this conversation. I did live in China during SARS, 2003. That was a very complicated year of my life. I don't know if that's going to come with this conversation, but in terms of what's true and what's not true, I definitely had to live through that in 2003. Before we get the slide, the last thing I'll say is that I just came back from Vietnam, and that was in January, but I spent 6 months there and definitely had a good understanding of the party structure there and the mass organizations and the role of independent activists. And what's important to say about this is that in the evolution of these socialist experiments, including China and Vietnam, is that people want reforms. And just because people want reforms, it somehow gets construed as counter-revolutionary, but it's not. It's just part of an evolution of what's happening in a society and a movement. And I just think that's the kind of conversation that would be really good to like dig into. Okay, so let's go into the slideshow. I have my own timer here, so I'm going to really not try to go into too much.
Hey, Alex, just to remember, you're doing your own slides.
Oh, I am? Oh, cool. I thought, oh, got it. Shit. Okay, it's all being recorded. I got you. Okay, no problem. I sent it to you, but okay. All right, here we go. Thank you. Where's the share button? Okay. Cool. So, I wanted, this is basically an article that I wrote in Organizing Upgrade, and I just wanted to kind of go over it briefly, not to like spend too much time on it, but I just thought it'd be good, and then we could kind of get into more specific questions. And I don't know if I'll go through all 10. Okay, so first slide. So of course, we've already heard about this. China's big, very diverse. And I wanted to lift this up because like when I was in China in 2003, I didn't know what to believe, okay? I had just arrived on the 7th day of when the SARS outbreak happened and went from Taiwan to Hong Kong, and I went to Guangzhou, which was the epicenter. So CNN was reporting all this like bullshit, basically about people running around in rubble, face masks, and like it just looked like a war zone. And I was in that city, and it was not like that, right? Meanwhile, the Chinese government was actually not talking about SARS and was only talking about the US bombing Iraq. So I was in this place where I was like, I don't know who to believe. And I just basically had to really trust my intuition and the information of the people, right? And I would say like the people around me all had different views. Some people were like, whatever, SARS, don't wear a face mask. And there were some people who were not leaving their homes, right? And that's just like, and I'm not saying that that's exactly what's happening now in China, but just to say like, it's like people have very different views in China and how they relate to things. So it's not a place that you can just say is a one way of like governing a society. Chinese identity is also very complex. And this is what I learned in Vietnam, talking to some of the party cadre who were basically the revolutionaries that won the war. First thing they would always remind me is that Vietnam was one of the first and probably only country to defeat China and the United States and the French. Now, it took them about 1,000 years to defeat China, right? Now, it's important to really talk about this because the Chinese identity, I think, have shifted from really, and this is what they were saying. They're like, look, your people have fought over and died over and killed others over your identity. And you have to just understand that. So the role of the state is much more, it's much more secured in China, right? And people have this very clear role and understanding. But what he lifted up was helpful. It's like, how do we shift from when you're in like a revolutionary period and you're fighting to defend your country from foreign aggression, which is a form of patriotism. But when you start to develop your country, the challenging part is like building internationalism versus nationalism. And I think these are the challenging things we're seeing, like what's happening in Hong Kong, right? And I would say that, you know, there are reactionary elements in that movement, but there's also socialist and left factions as well. And we have to really understand and dig into that. Now, do people want to be autonomous in Hong Kong? I think majority of people do not. They actually want reforms, right? So just to kind of think about the contours of the conversation is to really like name some of those things. And yeah, so there's some new kinds of discourse that's being developed around this. And I think Lausan Collective is one of them that's like trying to really dig into this contradiction. And I don't think it's easy, but I think that's a good starting place. The government is not the people necessarily. I mean, I think we want to say the government represents the people, but I also want to say that in my time in China and understanding the people there are all kinds of people in the government. So one example I want to lift up is like during like the Feminist Five movement, where there's like the big high profile case of feminists that were locked up, right? It was important because we were on this debrief call with them. Somehow we were able to do it through Skype and heard what was really happening. So they were like saying, well, there are feminists that are in the Chinese government that are like, you know, basically fuck patriarchy, right? And they're like, okay, so we are gonna kind of open up some space for feminist activists to kind of like enter and have some kind of a way to like push forward the government and like the reforms. The minute the feminists decided to tag team and make it an intersectional campaign with workers, and this has happened with Tiananmen Square too. It's like when that happened, when you kind of get to the core of capital, right? That's when people are like, whoa, we just thought this was gonna be a feminist thing. And so that's when the clampdown came down. But I guess I'm not saying it either or. I'm actually just saying there is a spectrum of people in the government, and I think that's important for people to understand. And yes, I just think it's important that we do not fall into the traps to be anti-China or pro-China without like a really rigorous conversation. Moving forward, so yes, I think this is probably what a lot of people in the chats are kind of referring to. It's like we need to be able to have rigorous and I would say an internal conversation about what's happening with the contradictions of the Chinese government. And we also need to like look at how like effed up the US government and you know, it's like basically it's like they're not equal, and I'm not in a place where they are like the same, but I do think it's important to lift up the initial mishandling of what happened of the Chinese government. But if they figured it out, they were quick to move on things much faster than the US government. And I think it's because, again, people in China are accessing like mutual aid efforts, self-organizing, along with the party stuff that's happening and the volunteers. But it's like it's a dynamic thing. I mean, come on, it's like a huge society, right? So it's like there's a lot of people just kind of thrown in, and because of that, the net is like I don't even know how to say that word, but the netizens, people online, have like voiced a lot of discontent. But again, the discontent is about having reforms in China, and I think there have been reforms and actually have been changes. So I'm at the halfway mark. China's wildlife and traditional medical industry is basically a product of global capitalism. Now, you know, we always debated this with the labor people in China. They're like, well, that's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I was like, well, yeah, but others were like, no, this is just basically state capitalism. And I was like, whatever it is, it doesn't seem like a good thing. So I don't care about what that's called, but let's just think about like this as an example, right? Chinese traditional medicine has become an industry, right? That I think like in the 70s was nothing, right? But now it's become something very big. And it's exploiting the people's like middle class and upper class kind of desires to like want to be like seen as wealthy and cultured. So they hyped up a lot of these like things and said these are things that will make you like virulent or stronger, all these kinds of things, right? So it's not global. It's not Chinese culture. It's global capitalism that is manipulating this. And yeah, you could call it other things, but I'm just want to lift that up. Number 6. This is just more around how transnational corporations will benefit, and we kind of already know that. But there is a big segment of capital in the U.S. that relies on China, right? So some of this, the U.S. trade wars, like there is interest among capitalists that don't want China to be attacked, right? And these are some of the reasons, because it is a huge market. Now, that's not to say like it's good or bad. It's just to name how complex this is all happening, right? Number 7. So I think this is some stuff that Amanda had been talking about. Like there's like a lot of, basically there's a lot of scapegoating of Chinese and Asian folks right now. And my take on it is like, it's important to identify some of the violence that's happening to Asians, as long as we can actually look at violence also as violence against, like poverty as violence, genocide as violence. Like we need to look at violence systemically. And I think it's good to kind of name the interpersonal things as well, because I think it's been agitating people to get more involved. But this is like a trend, right? So it's like there's a lot of scapegoating here in the US, and then the government is blaming or targeting Africans, and they've rectified that as well because of a lot of the pressure. But it's also happening in, you know, Hindu right is blaming Muslims in India, and there's also white nationalists that are blaming the Chinese government and Jews, right? So there's a cycle of hate that's happening that is just uplifting white nationalism, white supremacy. So in the end, we just need to figure out the new thread of like, what's the new we that we're trying to build. We're not going to bring everyone along, but we do need to bring a progressive international left. This one, yes, so basically, okay, this one's like maybe more straightforward. All workers are essential. Okay. Yeah, so this is actually some of the stuff that Amanda was talking about. There is already global cooperation and interdependence that's happening. We just need to lift that up. I'm not going to go into all of those things, but there are examples where scientists are working together, and we just have to like be able to say that it's like as the states fight each other, there are people on the ground, again, who are doing a lot of the work to like really, really try to figure out how to develop a vaccine. This is sort of like one of the earlier points, and I think this is to kind of address that there are a lot of contradictions that are happening in China around surveillance, repression of Uyghurs, workers, feminists. You can say all of those things. You could also say those things are happening in the US too. And I think you have to understand the dynamics of how all of that's happening. And to me, it's okay to name the problems, but it's like, what are people going to do about this? And this is very clear, a message that I heard from the Vietnamese revolutionaries. They're like, we need to develop people to people diplomacy. Like we need to understand and take the lead of people on the ground in China. And does attacking China right now, or even calling out all of these various things, does it allow for better kinds of organizing to happen? And I think that's a question, right? I don't think it is it's like trying to have a more dynamic understanding of like, how do we actually build a movement across in US and in China? And I would say right now it is very hard, right? It's very hard because of the repression that it's come up in China, but also as a reaction to the way the West has been attacking China and many of the other countries. So it's like, it's not so, it's more dynamic, right? To understand it that way. So really the idea is like, how do we connect our faiths together? And actually there are a lot of Chinese, of course, I mean, this is an obvious point, but there's a lot of Chinese people in the United States. There are a lot of international students. There are a lot of activists here, and they're like right under our noses, right? And I just feel like there's opportunities that we can connect with people and come up with a strategy to move forward. Last point here is yeah, we just got to stay eyes on the prize. Now, from anti-Asian violence being documented to attacks on China and defending China, to me, the main thing is we got to get rid of Trump. Okay, so, you know, and I know there's a bunch of abstentionists around in the left, which is another thing we have to struggle on. But really, Trump is it's like someone described it one time. Actually, I think it was my friend Alicia Garza. She's like, no one said Biden is your friend. No one said that, right? But Trump is definitely your enemy, and would be the kind of enemy where you have you're like on the edge of a cliff and you're about to like fall off, and he would like definitely be peeling your fingers off and laughing and bragging, tweeting about it later. So we got to know who the real enemy is. And I say this because it's not like getting rid of Trump is going to be changed everything, right? But getting rid of Trump allows us, it's like it creates a whole nother set of conditions to allow us to breathe just a little bit more. So we could even have more of these conversations and to strategize and to really think about how do we build power right now? And so that's what I wanted to end on. And there's more to say, but I'll just end it over there. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Alex. So now we'll enter the Q&A. So first, I guess I was going to ask Kevin, can you talk about or kind of describe what U.S. imperialism is, and what kind of separates U.S. imperialism from Chinese commerce or things that may get classified as Chinese imperialism?
Okay, so I think it's important to first of all define. It's important to define really what imperialism is, right? So when we talk about colonialism, we talk about imperialism. It's about the movement of economic surplus and economic goods, right? So when we have U.S. imperialism, the colonies occupied by the U.S., occupied by European countries, right? There's no development of a surplus, right? On the other hand, right, let's talk about Chinese foreign policy. China has been sending doctors to Africa for over 60 years now. Projects in the Belt and Road Initiative, they're building hospitals, they're building railroads, they're building power grids, they're building infrastructure. These are things that have not been able to develop under Western imperialism, right? Right, China itself was like almost like semi-colonized by Western imperialist powers, right? People like in 1949, they did not have electricity outside of like Shanghai. There was like the country was completely underdeveloped compared to Western counterparts. The GDP and GDP per capita were basically the same as those in like other global South countries in Africa and Latin America, right? So when we talk about imperialism, right, we don't have coercive grants such as those given by the IMF or the World Bank. We don't have neoliberal reforms instituted by the US, by the UK, or any other imperialist nation. Instead, we have a respect for sovereignty. We are constructing infrastructure. We are allowing an economy to develop in that space. And I think that's a critical difference, right? This is trade between nations. This is commerce. This is not like gutting of the state industry. This is not deprivation of resources to the working class. This is not all the profits of industries like oil, commerce, or telecommunications and oil and energy and fruit. This is not all of that going to Western companies abroad, right? Instead, we are strengthening industries inside. I'm sorry, were there any, what was the rest of the question?
No, I think you answered it. Amanda,
Right.
did you want to add? I can give you and Alex a chance to add to that. If not, then I'll ask Amanda. How can we combat this information war against China, especially the ones surrounding disease and old yellow peril propaganda that's not being revived?
Yeah, this is a question that I get a lot, and I'm not really sure. I always sort of struggle to like answer it in a satisfactory way, because like the U.S. Propaganda campaign against China is so like deeply embedded in the way that we conceptualize China that xenophobia is like the default American stance toward China, right? So I guess the best that I can offer is to first of all read Said's Orientalism to try and like sort of grasp, you know, the way that China is constructed and conceptualized and imagined, and how that relates to like US history of imperialism, read Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality. That's a really good resource in which he, you know, like, does a really good job of sort of tracking the way that US media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post has historically, you know, drummed up support for like not only foreign policy in terms of like, you know, its foreign policy toward Latin America during the Vietnam War, but also domestic policy, how, you know, newspapers like help to weaken the labor movement within the US. So once you read those two, you kind of get this like sort of framework that you need to sort of do this media critique in which you can like read New York Times and Washington Post articles with a bit of a more critical eye. And like, I guess after that, you can diversify the media that you consume, right? You can sort of seek out alternative media sources. Some examples that come to mind, Ajit Singh does a lot of really good work kind of deconstructing like media narratives around China. Vijay Prashad, who was mentioned earlier, I think in Kevin's presentation, he's been doing a lot of work doing the same thing, deconstructing these like media narratives around China in response to coronavirus. Carl Za, these are all people that can be found on Twitter, by the way. Carl Za, he does a really good podcast called Silk and Steel, which talks a lot about Chinese history and US and China relations. Another good resource is fair.org, which does a lot of media criticism, not only like in terms of China, but also in general. And I think it's also good to sort of balance, you know, like US media coverage with, you know, like Chinese news sources. And there are like several that, you know, offer news in English, like CGTN. That's a Chinese news site that publishes in English, and also People's Daily. So, you know, I think with those, you can develop like a more critical eye towards reading this kind of stuff.
Could I chime in too? Do you mind, Amanda?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right. So I think, so the question was about like US media discourse on China. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I was asking, what can we do to combat information?
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So I think Amanda provided some really great sources that I follow myself. And I think kind of like a guiding principle that I like to kind of turn back to is follow the money. Like follow the money of where, like of who is funding these news sources. Like, and I've seen this in the a little bit in the chat as well, but you know, there tends to be this weird duality or weird dichotomy of like private versus state media, where state media is basically chastised as propaganda, or it's basically you know, anything that's funded by any kind of state is going to be immediately dismissed, right? But the same level of criticism is not going to apply to, you know, capitalist media, right? In the US, you know, this could be New York Times, which is owned by Carlos Slim, the richest man in Mexico. This could be, you know, the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, who is, you know, Jeff Bezos. We have the entirety of News Corporation, right, which is, you know, Rupert Murdoch, and which is not even to like mention like cable, like the state of cable news in the US. And then even in like, even in China, right? We have like the South China Morning Post, which is owned by a billionaire. We have things like Apple Daily, which is funded by Jimmy Lai, like this like magnate, right? I think that it's very important to apply the same level of criticism, apply the same level of scrutiny to capitalist media sources as we do to state media sources. So, because one is of a capitalist, one is of a state. In China's case, it's of what I consider a socialist state, right? A capitalist media will serve the capitalists, like full stop, right? State media will serve the interests of the state. In China's case, that is to serve basically peace for the people, peace and stability for the people, right? It's important just to keep those, keep that lens, right? And I think it's good to be critical. It really is. That said, with this information war, right? We see this coming from both sides of the US 2020 election, right? We have Trump kind of being Trump, and he doing all these things to kind of scapegoat China as an excuse for his own incompetence. We have Biden, who's basically engaging in this pissing contest of Chinese racism with Trump, right? So, and we have media outlets supportive of Biden, right? Who are basically giving them a platform for anti-Chinese racism and basically this new level of McCarthyism. So yeah, it's important to maintain that level of criticality. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. So for Alex, I wanted to ask, you like to bring a nuanced view into China, which many appreciate, but how can we unite as an anti-war left while also incorporating, the nuances that you bring up?
Yeah, it's complicated in the sense that we are behind. We are really behind as a US left in understanding what's happening in China on the ground, and also to sort through whatever is state media, private media. Like there's a lot of this disinformation that has to be peeled through. And I think it's going to take some time. I mean, I consider like my information is like people's media. It's like people that I know personally that are in China that I can verify what's happening. And that's not everyone can do that. But I think this moment has been really important because all of a sudden, like people on the left are having much, and I would say, I think maybe there is a part of the left that has always been really curious and lifting up the role of China. So that is like the Chinese Progressive Association was one of the first organizations to even lift up the revolution in Chinatown, right? Our history basically is founded on people's friendship in China, right? And as the country evolved and progressed from 79 from the Shanghai Communique to 89 for Tiananmen Square, which still many of our members even say is like, that is propaganda. That didn't happen, right? And we were one of the first organizations to say that we actually sympathize with the protesters in 89. And that was a very hard position. That was in the Chinese community. But I'm saying that because it's like at every step and every moment, we actually have to be connected to people on the ground, right? I'll give another example. There was an Adidas factory in called Yuyuan, and there was all this stuff that's happening. There's like, oh, the Chinese government, local authorities did this. It was like all of this information we had to sift through, and we didn't know what to do because we were told actually by some activists, by expressing solidarity in the US, it makes the Chinese government more suspicious of them. So then we're like, so do you want solidarity or you do not? And so literally like hours before, I was like 6 hours before our action, they're like, okay, we talked to the workers in the Adidas factories and we should do it. I mean, that was like, And I know not everyone can do that, right? But maybe this is the opportunity for people on the left to actually follow the leadership of people who are talking to people on the ground, right? And I think we should just absorb all this information, like the varying perspectives on this panel. Like, this is why I like love this panel. This is like the first time I feel like the left is actually trying to really complicate what's happening, but not in a way where, I mean, I know that the highest contradiction is US imperialism. It's very clear. But among that, there are many other kinds of contradictions. And that is just, I mean, it's like movement physics. It's normal, right? But if we cannot identify and strategize what are the primary contradictions, that at its core is like what's really important. But I think this is like the beginning or a continuation of trying to thread these conversations, and it has to be very delicate. I mean, I can't even mention all the people that I'm like in touch with, right? And these are my friends who have been jailed and locked up. It's not like, it's like, I rarely read the Washington Post and the New York Times because it costs money. Okay. You know what I'm saying? It's like, we just got to really hold all of the contradictions. And this is kind of like, this is going to be obviously like recorded, and a lot of people are going to watch this. So you can't have a real in-depth conversation, right? But behind closed doors, the left needs to be able to dig into these contradictions more in a much smaller setting, right? Because it is about people to people diplomacy, and we're not going to get answers immediately. Because like right now, the way that things are set up is like people barely are able to have interaction with each other. Now, from 2005 to 2015, that was a decade where there was some ability to even like be able to do that. And I think that moment might come up again because of like what's going to be the groundswell that's happening in China, right? But the people decide that. We don't decide that, right? So anyways, I appreciate this conversation. Hope we can dig in more. And, I think there's a lot of questions in the chats. I can't keep up with them, but people can also just reach out to me separately as well.
We have some time left. So I want to ask if any of you want to clarify the differences between the state, the Communist Party, the government, the communes and communal councils that exist.
Sure. So China is a one-party state. Although the ruling party is the communist power, is the party in power. There are also 8 different ancillary political parties within China, including, see off the top of my head, I can name like the 九三学社, I can name like the 民盟. But so what these the function of these parties is essentially because people-to-people organizing, right? They provide valuable networks. For instance, and they have different demographics, right? For instance, you have like the 九三学社, which is dedicated to connecting intellectuals with one another. There's a similar structure among the Communist Party as well. So remember that the membership is around 90 million people out of a country of 1 billion, right? So every now and then, Communist Party members they take courses on political theory, right? That is one of the functions of the Communist Party, is to basically continue to educate its members on the developments of Chinese policy and Chinese socialism, as well as reviewing basic tenets of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. So then, so that's the state. It's run by the party, right? And we see that the Chinese state is actually extremely flexible, right? The government now is basically unrecognizable from the government in 1976, right? We see that Eric Lee, a political scientist and venture capitalist, he points out that like, although the party does not change, the state changes immensely. And so that, we see that we have, continuing reforms going from 1949, going to 1978. We have, we still see changes in structure happening today. So we see this neighborhood structure, right? When I say a neighborhood, that might be unclear to people who are less familiar with China, but these are these are essentially like giant apartment complexes, right? There are going to be a couple of thousand people living in these apartment complexes. And so these communes, right, there are basically a vestige of the Maoist commune system. And now, like what the communes are now, like beforehand, right, before the pandemic, they're essentially like people who make up like some like security, like unarmed security. You have people who are in charge of parking. You have people in charge of like opening like the turnstiles when you drive your car in, right? But in the response to this pandemic, right, the structure of this commune changes. The number of volunteers, increases exponentially, right? So this is an example of the flexibility of structure and the relationship between the people, the party, and the state.
Thanks. Amanda, do you foresee the masses of the US kind of having good access to alternative media? You named a bunch of media sources for us to chase after and look into, and I personally, follow all of them as well. But the US state is so good at censoring all of that, and all that's left is only the US narrative, which kind of enters our mind. How can we better spread that information?
Yeah, I do think that Western imperialist media is one of the biggest obstacles to global solidarity, because it's not just Western media, it's the education system in the US itself as well, right? Because from the time that we enter elementary school, we're taught this deep anti-communist propaganda, and this sort of valorization of the US national project and US free market capitalism as a whole. And so that's the narrative that we're taught from a very early age, from the very beginning. And so, once you realize that that's what's imposed on you, then you have to sort of begin this process of unlearning all of that stuff. And that really takes time. So I don't know how optimistic I can be, given what we're up against, given, corporate media's stranglehold on the US media, or on the US narrative itself. So I don't know if I have a really good answer on how to counter it. The best I can do is to, attend these panels like this and try to, offer a counter narrative. But as for the, an individual, I'm not sure how to counter it. But if anyone else has suggestions, that I would be open to them.
Alex, do you think organizers on the ground, you say you have good contact with people in the community there, do you think they're also prone to Western media and propaganda warfare?
If they get access to it, I think, yeah, I think that in global imperialism, the US obviously has a very big role. I also think that, at least in China, it is very clear that it's very clear that people know the difference. And I can say this because, sorry, thought I saw my child. I can say this because, organizing in Chinatown in San Francisco and having even Chinese media in the US has a certain has a certain take, right? There's some that are, there's certain newspapers that are supported by the Chinese government, Taiwan government, and Hong Kong, right? And this is the thing, and I'm not trying to say this in a certain way, but like Chinese people have a very sophisticated way of understanding the world. And in some ways, some of our members have said, we understand complex things. We can read Falun Gong. Like they would say this, like Falun Gong has their paper, which I'm always like, oh, that's like, and they're like, look, we know the difference. Like their local news is actually good. Their stuff on China is not.
Sorry, do you want to expand on what Falun Gong is for some viewers who don't know?
Falun Gong is sort of like it has presented as like an anti-China media outlet that recently was like funded by Trump. Anyways, it's like it's a clearly anti-China apparatus. And there's a whole history with that too, because like they tapped into like the neoliberal reforms in China when China joined the WTO. So they did build a base in China, as did the Christians. I mean, these are things like that are happening because China is just a big country, right? But I would say that our members have pushed back on us saying like, don't think we're that dumb. We can decipher what's happening here, right? And to some degree, like that's like changed my way of how they think about things, right? Because I have struggled over, even the impact of the Tiananmen Square, right? Like I had to actually go to China to meet people in Beijing, and I was like, look, Chinese people in the US have been telling me that it wasn't that bad. And you have to go and talk to the people. I mean, there's many generations from now, right? But it's just to say, again, the hardest thing about this with the security issues is we need to connect with the people, right? And I'll give another example. I don't know if this is helpful, but just like thinking about like the anti-China sentiments, right? That is pervasive. I wouldn't just say it's from the West, right? But I think there is, there's like, you can hear some of that's happening in Africa and the other places of the globe, right? But there is a critical role for Chinese in the US, especially young Chinese folks who came here in high school and or in college, because we're in the belly of the beast and we have the most privilege here to really be able to, I would say, stand up to some of the things that are happening in China, but mostly the chauvinism, white supremacy, and the attacks on China and Chinese people. Now, to me, because I'm organizing in the Chinese community, that's helped me figure out a pathway. And where does that fit into the left overall in that conversation? It's not until now that there are more people really interested in finding out what's happening in China. And I think it's good energy. This is great. So like, I think the questions people are asking are good. And I would just say like one of the learning moments for us, and this came up in the chat, so it's a lot of chatter, is that we were CPA, we were working with some of the indigenous in the Sapara of people of Ecuador, of really their campaign to basically go and counter the deal that Ecuador's set with China. And it was not China, it was like Sinopec, I think. It was either 10 or 20 billion for exchange for oil extraction, right? And the government overrode the indigenous people. So we were in this process of like meeting with them, and it was clear that there were certain things that they were conflating. So around China and the Chinese people and the Chinese government. But it was through this people-to-people interaction that we were able to be able to show the indigenous people that actually Chinese people actually are aligned with indigenous people. But they had this huge sign that said China out of Ecuador. And our members were like, I I understand your struggle, but when you say China out of Ecuador, it reminds me of the Indonesian government telling me to get out of Indonesia because I'm Chinese. Because there's been a diasporic backlash of Chinese people all over the world, right? And so I think some of the challenges to this is like, if we don't have those people-to-people interactions, we're not going to really be able to transform the dynamics, right? And we joined them in going to the Chinese embassy to present their letter, and that made a big difference, right? And that was a decision we made on our own. And we have a relationship with the Chinese embassy. Like, we actually have I've had to have various conversations with them about our positioning, but it's always been very mindful of not falling into the traps of what the white nationalists and the kind of xenophobia kind of narrative trap, right? But I think it is very complicated. Like, how would people on this webinar know how to do that? It's like, for us, it's like talking to our members and our people and the contacts we have. That's the best way we can figure out the accountability. So I don't know if that helps. It probably makes it like not as helpful because not everyone can do that. But lifting up that we can actually talk to people and lift up these kind of conversations is the first start.
Do you mind if I add on to your response?
Sure.
If
you're short, then because I'm
yeah, sure. I know you mentioned like the Falun Gong, but I think you skimmed a little bit on what they actually were and why they generate so much controversy. So in the 90s, right? This is back like in the 90s, Falun Gong kind of emerged as this kind of health craze, but actually kind of cultish in their behavior. So for those of you that don't know, if you'll see these signs kind of in the US advertising this show called like Shenyuan, right? That's basically closely affiliated with the Falun Gong. They surround this cult leader named Li Hongzhi, who has for several years now, just regurgitated all this far right propaganda. He's a cultist. He believes that God sent Trump to the world to destroy communist China. In the 90s, he was telling his followers, like, don't eat medicine. Don't eat medicine. Like, if you pray, your karma will go away. That's like, they're appropriating this tradition of Buddhism and karma. And so this is a public health threat. This is as if anti-vaxxers had this enormous platform, right? Bigger than anything like anti-vaxxers have in the US, right? So, you ask a Chinese person, have they heard of Falun Gong? Of course they've heard of Falun Gong, right? Many of them have, like in the 90s, had family members who were part of it, right? And, there were really terrible things that happened, right? You get cancer and then they say, oh, this is your karma. If you pray and get good karma, you're going to be treated. This is why they generate so much controversy in China, because they're ignoring the health system. This is a public health issue. And the duty of the Communist Party is ultimately to its people. That's who they're accountable for, right? There's this history of uprisings in China. If the Communist Party does a bad job, right, the people are going to overthrow them. This happened in 1911. This happened in 1949. And when unrest happens in 1989, the government responds to it. Okay. So, Falun Gong, bunch of Trump lovers, far right people, they shouldn't be given a platform. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to pose one more question to everyone. And so, this came from the audience as well. So, where do you position yourselves with anti-colonialism, especially around the Great Turtle Island? And how can the Chinese diaspora, contribute to kind of dismantling or, contribute to the left's goal of dismantling the U.S. settler state? And if so, have there been instances of the Chinese American diaspora, contributing to that left?
Do you mind if I start?
Yeah, but I ask everyone to please be brief, and so we can wrap up.
Yeah. So at the end of my talk, at the end of my lecture, I talked a little bit about growing militarism. And these are bases, right? The US is constructing bases in Hawaii, in Okinawa, in Guam, among other places. These are indigenous lands that have been illegally seized from indigenous people, right? So aggression against China can only happen through the seizure of these lands, right? Remember that it relies and American imperialist aggression relies on these lands, relies on these stolen lands, okay? So like that's, you know, if you want to fight militarization, if you want to fight like aggression against China, like these two go hand in hand ultimately. So I think Chinese people, in order to support the struggles of the indigenous people, they have to fight the militarization. They have to fight the escalation against China.
Thanks, Kevin. Anyone else? And I think we can wrap up otherwise. Okay.
So the founders of our organization pretty much go way back with many of the indigenous leaders of AIM, Black Panther Party, in those times of calling for internationalism and really trying to really build a new kind of a movement. And it's not to say to stay fixed in that era, but so much of our politics is informed by global solidarity, working class solidarity, and really combating some of the really dangerous trends of nationalism, right? But probably more important out of this is like I've been able to see people have span of like 40 years of a relationship to understand the contradictions, which is why I talk about it a lot. The kind of principled struggle of like how people can discuss and get through issues. And so you know, and I just want to make sure people know, like in all of my comments, to me, the core contradiction is still US imperialism. And there are a lot of other ones that I've been lifting up maybe more in this conversation. But it's very clear to me that China has had a very important role in funding left experiments in Latin America, for example, and other parts of the world. But we have to really think about what is a progressive and left internationalism going to look in the 21st and 22nd century.
Thanks, Alex. Amanda, I saw you wanted to speak.
Yeah, I mean, just to say briefly, you know, like if you compare the two countries' responses to this COVID-19 crisis, you have on one hand the US, which has the highest infection rate right now in the world, and COVID-19 has become like this accelerationist thing that has kind of revealed these racial and class fault lines that, you know, already existed in this country to begin with, right? For instance, in New York City, where I live, we've had a lot of MTA workers and grocery store employees like falling ill to COVID and dying. I just read an article the other day, you know, like we imagine New York City as the epicenter of the crisis, but actually the Navajo Nation now has surpassed New York City in terms of infection rate per capita. So you have this model of responding to the crisis, and then you have China, which, you know, like implemented strict lockdown measures and flattened the curve really early. And then once it, you know, got its own epidemic under control, it started to, you know, donate PPE and medical supplies to other countries. It donated countries like Iran, where, you know, the COVID-19 crisis was exacerbated by these crippling US sanctions. It started donating medical supplies to Cuba. And so, I mean, I think we can look at China as a model, like maybe an imperfect model, to how for international solidarity and international cooperation in terms of something like this.
Thanks so much, Amanda, for highlighting, especially the Navajo struggle. So I think we'll wrap up here. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank the panelists for joining us as well and speaking. So next week, we'll be discussing prison abolition and building solidarity, international solidarity with prisoners of the U.S. empire, U.S. state. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you all.